going to share my screen, share my audio. I'm going to move to the chat with Danielle and mute myself and then open house.
Hi, everybody. It's so great to see so many familiar faces and names in the Zoom audience. For those of you who maybe don't know me, my name is Danielle Hartunian. I go by she, her pronouns, and I'm the Associate Director of Alumni Relations for the Gallatin School of Individualized Study here at NYU. And we're thrilled to welcome you to our session this afternoon, Conversations with Gallatin Faculty, featuring Professor George Shulman. And we're also thrilled to welcome you to NYU Alumni and Parents Weekend, which kicked off earlier this week and is in full swing. This is actually our very last Gallatin event of the weekend, so hopefully you've been able to join them so far. There are lots of other virtual programs happening through tomorrow, so across the university. So if you want to join anything else, you can log into the Alumni and Parents Weekend event portal and look through the calendar of events. Before we get started officially, I want to give a quick shout out to my Gallatin colleagues who are working their magic behind the scenes to make this event as smooth as possible. Jen Burge, our Associate Director of Theater Production and now Zoom production. Rachel Plutzer, our Senior Director of Events and Special Programs. And Jessica Lee, our Chief of Staff and resident Gallatin alum during Alumni Weekend. Thank you all for all your help. With that, I'm delighted to formally introduce our amazing panelists today who will be discussing the theme Truth and Narrative in Politics, which you'll hear a little bit more about later. Leading the conversation this afternoon is Professor George Shulman, who will join us on camera. George's interests lie in the fields of political thought and American studies. He teaches and writes on political thought in Europe and the US, as well as on Greek and Hebrew traditions, both tragic and biblical. He is the recipient of the 2003 NYU Distinguished Teaching Award, and his teaching and writing emphasized the role of narrative in culture and politics. In conversation with Professor Shulman are his own former advisees and now alumni. I'm going to introduce them in alphabetical order by last name. So first up is Emma Kaywin. Hey, Emma. Emma graduated from Gallatin in 2010. Their concentration was titled The Philosophy of the Abnormal, which interrogated how norms are constructed and what happens to those deemed abnormal or deviant. Mostly they focused on the nexus of queerness and monstrosity in pop culture. Currently, they are an adjunct professor at Brooklyn College, where they teach an undergraduate class on gender and sexuality minority identity in America. They are also a teaching associate at Teachers College, Columbia University, where they support multiple graduate courses in conflict resolution. They hold an MA in health education and are working toward a doctorate in education in the same at Teachers College. Their dissertation focuses on supporting sexual safety for gender and sexuality minority patrons of nightlife. To survive under capitalism, they currently do way too many things, including writing grants for public health and education programs, developing trauma-informed policies and procedures for nightlife operators, facilitating mediations for cases of sexual misconduct, and leading trainings around consent and sexual safety. Thank you, Emma, for joining us. Next up is Frank McShane, who graduated from Gallatin in 2019. While at Gallatin, Frank studied the history of global capitalism and American social movements, crafting a concentration titled, aptly, Capitalism and Social Movements. This program of study told the story of how capitalism generates and shapes working class movements seeking change, specifically through a close study of the civil rights movement, the labor movement, and emancipation during Civil War. Upon graduation, Frank was named the recipient of the Richard J. Copenal Award for Distinguished Interdisciplinary Study. Since graduating, he has been working as a paralegal case handler at the Legal Aid Society's Housing Justice Unit, organizing tenant associations and helping them file affirmative cases against abusive landlords. He is currently applying to law school and expects to matriculate in the fall of 2022. Thank you, Frank, for being here. And finally, Sabrina Treacy graduated from Gallatin in 2019. She finished with a concentration in critical theory, race, and narrative in the law. Sabrina first focused on performance studies and critical theory throughout, but quickly became obsessed with the intersection of race and the law. An avid reader, some of her favorite scholarly encounters included ones with Frantz Fanon, W.E. Du Bois, Saidiya Hartman, and Vincent Brown. Currently, Sabrina works in tech, passively analyzing the performative aspects of capitalism, and hopes to one day obtain both her JD and a doctorate in American Studies. Always an impressive lineup with Gallatin alumni. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to George.
Hi, everybody. So welcome to this occasion to think about and talk out loud about a cluster of ideas around truth and narrative. As many of you know, I work a lot with the question of what's the relationship between truth and the stories we tell. And at the simplest, in the most simplistic and sort of cartoonish way, they're really two very different views of the relationship between truth and narrative. One basically says that stories are fiction and fiction is false, and then they're truths, and stories always are false. And the other simplistic, cartoonish view of the relationship between truth and narrative is that we bear witness, we testify, we tell truths by telling stories. And somewhere in between those two caricatures are a set of implicit criteria about what would characterize a better narrative, or a more believable or credible, or one might say truer narrative. And that in turn raises the question, well, what's the relationship between facts, quote unquote, and the stories that we tell? And I want to take a minute and linger on that before to set up a kind of problem space for these wonderful minds to play with. And I want to do so through Hannah Arendt when she was writing about what she called totalitarianism, but I would call fascism. And her question was, how is it that millions of people lost their connection to the factual world? And she created the expression defactualization for what happens in moments of kind of cultural breakdown or totalitarian homogenization. And she described people losing hold of the world partly because they become atomized, because they've lost associational bonds with each other. And on the other hand, they're organized by one media apparatus. In the case of the Nazis, that was the Nazi Party. In the United States case, it would be the 40% of the population that listen only to Fox News. But the combination of atomization and media concentration for Arendt produced the possibility of people losing a common sense about the world. But what's so important and interesting about Arendt's argument that seems also so important now is that there's sort of two implications that I want to really highlight. Thinking about our own moment with the big steal or the big lie, and as well about QAnon. One is that factual truths, when so-and-so invaded so-and-so, whether there was a Holocaust, whether there was slavery, that these factual truths are not themselves self-supporting, that you actually require a world that sustains people's attachment to factual truths. And that absent that kind of political support, people can enter a kind of space in which they lose conviction. It's not so much that they're indoctrinated into a false truth as that they lose a sense of conviction that there is truth, that there is actually something factually solid that they can take as such. And they actually lose the sense of that facts are real, that the facts are real. The second important idea that Arendt introduces way back in 1952 through 53, 54, as she's trying to make sense of what happened with Hitler and Stalin, is a distinction between what she calls truth and meaning. And her argument is that the fact of slavery or the fact of the Holocaust is not self-evidently meaningful. What it means, what it amounts to, how we ought to understand it is a totally different question that goes beyond whether we accept that a certain event happened. So that Arendt puts enormous attention on the question of the meaning that we make of things. And that is where Arendt introduces the idea of narrative. And that meaning is not self-evident, but something that's produced by people through politics and through narration, so that slavery can be made meaningful in many ways. And we're seeing that now in debates over critical race theory, in which people are not denying the fact of slavery. What they're denying is its centrality in American history. They're denying that you need to put that at the center of your story of American history, as opposed to treating slavery as anomalous or incidental in American history. They're not arguing about the fact of it. They're arguing about how to interpret its meaning, which includes as well whether slavery is explained by white supremacy is an ongoing reality, and so on. That involves claims about reality, but it is part of an interpretation of what slavery actually meant that makes it no longer an event in the past, but an ongoing structure that has an afterlife in the present. So what I'm trying to introduce by way of talking about Arendt is to think about what Americans are arguing about now. Climate change, the debate about, I guess I could do it through 3 dates. The debate about 1619 versus 1776, but one also has to say 1496 against both of them. Debates about critical race theory, debates about what happens in these elections, and so on. So the question that I guess I want to give you a chance to sort of talk with each other about is the ways in which people compose narratives, or the way in which to make an argument about what's important and what really matters, and what an understanding of how the world is organized, that requires narrative. But you're also in a world where people are living by other kinds of narratives, conspiratorial, paranoid, that we need to think about how to argue against those narratives without making it seem that we can live without them. That we need to find a way to argue about how people make meaning without implying that the meaning of things is self-evident. We need to find a way to think about distorting or mistaken or destructive forms of storytelling or forms of narrative without assuming that we can avoid the practice of storytelling itself. So I was thinking that in your experience, in your studies with sexuality and sexual categories in terms of race and American nationhood, in terms of the law, in terms of how we understand the truths of capitalism, different things that you guys have studied in your times, whether there's some way you want to work with the materials that you have at your fingertips and talk about these questions. Somebody get started, make a statement, and let's see what happens.
Sure. Yeah, I'll go. I think one thing that George, you're kind of getting at, and my apologies if I'm kind of not approaching this in the exact same way that you just laid out. One thing I think you're getting at is this idea that we can combat things like QAnon or like Stop the Steal by exposing these people to the truth or the facts, and that alone is kind of a weapon to fight against these movements. And that's something that's always kind of annoyed me, honestly. I feel like I was just back home with my parents for a while. They watch MSNBC pretty religiously, and I think that's kind of a refrain you hear over and over, like, look, they're lying. Well, yeah, of course, there's a class of people who are lying because it benefits them. But the people who are buying into those lies are doing so largely because, as you said, they're atomized and they live in a society that is in, at least in my eyes, in full-blown crisis. And they, to be honest, rightfully don't trust the institutions that they're supposed to look to for truth, for, you know, quote unquote, yeah, truth or fact, that in their eyes, and frankly, in a lot of people's eyes, those institutions have totally discredited themselves. And so when they're told, look to these institutions, they're the ones who are telling the truth and you're a conspiracy theorist, it kind of just pushes them further down the road that they're already going down. I think that's kind of the big thing I came into this conversation thinking, that if we are going to fight conspiracy thinking and narrative making about untruth and the movements that they generate, we can't do it by just saying, well, the institutions that you think are corrupt, are discredited, they're actually fine. Everything's fine with them and you're just wrong. So there has to be some sort of accountability. There has to be a sort of collective movement, I think, to de-atomize people. But there certainly has to be something new. That's kind of my opening thought.
So you're really opening with the idea that no wonder truth is in crisis, because all authorities in the world warrant a kind of deserved suspicion. And that in the case of vaccines, the state has indeed used people shamelessly and lied to them. And so there are real reasons to distrust authority, although why and how that can be weaponized and how the weapon could be disarmed is not so clear to me, because the attack on authority ends up authorizing Fox News. And people suspend disbelief in that regard. And I don't know that I understand that. Why should that institution be exempt from the general suspicion directed at every other institution? There's something, it's not unlike what happened with Hitler as well. But that I find that, any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I would actually love Emma's insight on this, on the question that I have about this. I don't know if I'm more concerned about the institution of things at this point. Frank and I were actually going back and forth about this last week, about like, what is like the role of social movement and change and la da 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 da. Like, what is our agency in combating false narrative and misinformation and disinformation? And I've been like fundamentally landing on the fact that like, I don't give a fuck about like a person's politic or a person's beliefs or whatever. Like, I'm so concerned about whether or not the person is safe from violence, is housed, and is fed. And I think like that may be such a pessimistic thought, because I don't know if combating narrative, right, is a part of the work that I want to do and is a part of something that I think I will accomplish in this lifetime, not personally, but also on a macro level. Like, I don't think that's going to be an accomplishment up until, God willing, I live to 2100 or whatever. So like right now, I see myself saying, okay, I am going to make sure my neighbor is fed. I'm going to make sure my neighbor is housed. And I ask Emma specifically because like you work in a space in which, from what I can tell, that you're interacting with all types of people, but your main goal is to prevent harm. And I just like, I wonder how that feels like, and like what that meeting somebody at where they're at, regardless of ideology, like how that fits
leaving
with
as
narrative.
if it leaves narrative out of it.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Hey,
I mean,
Emma.
you just handed me sort of exactly kind of what I wanted to say in response to Frank also, which is this idea of like the needs level, right? And so, and this is something that we do, like I'm a trained mediator, and this is what we do in mediation is, you know, there's like the problem, and then there's underneath the iceberg, like what's actually the problem. And so, you know, both George and Frank identified some of the main problems that we are having right now, and we can bring a bunch more in. But something, I promise I'm not doing this to pander, but literally I actually think about this all the time. There was a class that I took at Gallatin with Sarah Murphy on guilt. And we talked about the difference between legal guilt and emotional guilt. And I use this all the time in my work because I work in cases of sexual violence where it's like, okay, yes, like this is a legal issue, you know, but also there are emotional issues. And if we're going to work within you know, an abolitionist framework of, you know, separate from the carceral system, you know, like, so yes, rape, you know, somebody raped someone else like that, you could get the carceral system involved. You can't really do the same thing with like, you know, my cousins into QAnon, you know, but there's still all the same sort of like emotionality around it. And the sense of sort of getting to the feelings and the needs and these things that I think are sort of the most important. And so kind of one response is like, you know, what do these people need? Like when someone is feeling like they are, you know, like they do not trust authority, but then they also are, you know, following QAnon, following Fox News, which is like, I mean, that's like the big daddy right there, you know, like that is authority. So they need authority, but they're deciding which authority to be part, you know, to be underneath. They are getting something from that authority. What is it that they are getting? If we can't just say, don't listen to Fox News, it's garbage or it's poison, like George is saying, like you can't just tell people not to do that. But I think something that we need to think about is like, you know, exactly what you're saying, Sabrina, like, are these people housed? Are these people fed? And not just literally, but, you know, they were promised things in the American dream that, you know, they have not been given. And it's not up to us to give it to them, but it is maybe up to us to listen and to hear the suffering that comes from that. I don't know. That's sort of my first take on it.
But I mean, I guess if it, I mean, even suffering is not simply self-evident in its meaning. I want to say. I mean, there's pain. There's maybe the simple sensation of pain, but as soon as you start talking about suffering, you're already way far into the operation of language and representation and narrative. And I can't imagine not, I mean, yes, you want to hear what people are really feeling and how they understand their feelings is already to then be talking about how they narrate their feelings, and then you might be able to offer them a different kind of interpretation that takes their feelings seriously but makes them meaningful in a different, maybe more constructive way. But it would seem to me that listening in itself, I guess, might establish that you're a trustworthy person, that you are taking them seriously. But I don't know that just needs are, I mean, let's say that Biden and the Democrats, by some miracle, pass, you know, $3.5 trillion worth of benefits, let's say. The fact that there are those benefits is not in itself going to make a damn bit of difference unless they're made meaningful in a way that will modify people's political identifications. So it seems to me that, I don't know, I guess the idea that you could get beneath the ideology and just listen to people, I don't find that, I guess I'm not sure I find that, I want you to say more about what that listening actually would entail.
I think to contextualize my feelings around that, to understand that I am at such a pessimistic level of my contributions to the future, is to have that understanding, being like, I cannot accomplish organizing somebody, but what I can accomplish is meeting their needs where their needs need to be met. because I don't know, like, I don't know if I necessarily have a role in being able to like change somebody's mind. And I don't know if that's worth, not even change somebody's mind, shift the narrative that they're listening to and the narrative that they understand and believe. I don't know if that's possible. And I think that that is something that I would also like to have a conversation about. It's like whether or not like where should we be putting our energy and what should our goal be in terms of being there for our neighbors, and whether that means like changing their narrative or feeding them.
Frank, do you have a thought about that?
Yep. Yeah, Sabrina and I have been talking about this for a while. I have a broad disagreement with Sabrina here about, even if it's not possible, like, let's just say it's not possible to change someone's mind or anything, or excuse me, I'm sorry, not that. Let's just say you can't do that. Like, that doesn't change the fact that in my mind, the only way out of these multiple crises that we're in is to organize people. The only way out in my mind is to bring people, broadly speaking, in my political ideal, it would be a working class political movement of people who have similar material interests, who
To meet their needs.
to meet their material real needs. And we can argue about what's real or what an actual need is, but I think there are things that we would agree that people broadly need in their life. And George, I think to your point about if the Democrats were able to pass this bill, that it wouldn't make a difference unless there was some political meaning there. And that, I think, is kind of the key for me, right? Like, if the Democrats were able to materially help people, right? If they were able to give them, I forget how much the child tax credit is, but it's like $600 a month or something. They were able to lower healthcare premiums, if they were able to provide childcare, et cetera, et cetera. And that came along with an understanding that, wow, this is perhaps for the first time in my life, a way that the government actually helped me out. Like, I guess government and politics can actually be a force for good in my life, because the way our system is structured now, I mean, if you're just a regular person who has to deal with some government office, odds are it's because something terrible is happening to you and you are having a miserable time. And so I think that kind of gets back to my original point of people not trusting these institutions. And I don't mean to say that they don't trust authority. I think specifically right-wing folks really crave authority. They just don't trust the institutions that are, I guess, overseeing everything right now. But if we were able to kind of restructure that and say, look, if you work together, the state can actually be a force for good, and it can actually provide material benefits to you and make your life better. I think that would, although certainly not, like, at risk of saying, oh, if we get Medicare for all, there's no need for, like, QAnon disappears. Not what I'm saying. But I do think that that would sort of ease some of this widespread distrust and penchant for conspiracy thinking.
What do you think, Emma?
I'm thinking about behavior change because I'm a health person, and we know that that's the hardest thing. And we've really, really seen that this year with COVID. And I think that I know that behavior change is extremely hard, and that ideological change is very hard. And I also know, because this is my background, that there are evidence-based ways that it can work on an individual level. And so I'm thinking about how activists don't take that sort of content into account, that type of literature. I use it in my work, but that's very sort of unusual. And it's just
By that literature, you mean evidence-based stuff, that if you do this, if you do X, then Y happens?
Less like that, but so there's a bunch of really good research into how to become anti-racist. There is research in how to start having conversations about race with people who are racist. The same thing, you know, I'm a trans person. I have these conversations all the time with a lot of people who do not think that I should exist or be allowed to be myself. And so there is all of this literature, but what I'm not seeing is any of this. And then, okay, so there's that literature, and then there's also the literature of just like, how do we get people to eat healthier? And, you know, like these more sort of like standard healthcare stuff. But what I don't see is it being talked about as much in the problem space that we're talking about now. And I think that it could be, and that maybe that could kind of bridge some of the issues between like what Frank thinks is possible and what Sabrina thinks is possible. Because we do know, I mean, I'm not saying that it's easy or that it's going great, obviously, because, you know, we're still in a country that is experiencing a lot of racism, is experiencing a lot of transphobia, homophobia, all these things. But just to say that there are really brilliant people working on this, and that I get jazzed when I read, you know, content about, you know, how people are doing, you know, different ways of helping heal harm, different ways of, you know, alternatives to incarceration, all these sorts of things. But then with QAnon, it's like, take the computer away from the kid. And you're like, wait a minute, how can we be a little bit more evidence-based and nuanced in the way that we're talking about this massive problem of ideology in this country?
I mean, what connects what Sabrina was saying to what you're saying is a certain kind of listening, because it's a practice that creates a relationship. And so what organizing is about in the deepest democratic sense is creating associational ties, relationships, by people listening to each other, but also by talking about their experience and their needs. So I think that's a kind of horizontal process of creating a shared understanding. And this, in politics, it's called deep canvassing. And it's organized not around getting a person to vote for one candidate or the other, but actually really inhabiting a town or a world, or people developing relationships over time. It's a much slower process. It's not organized around candidates or elections, but it involves getting people into conversation. It is really what's behind the Gallatin pedagogy of what the seminar was supposed to be about, is a shared inquiry in which people develop the capacity to trust or listen, both trust and listen to each other. And then disagreements in a sense can be contained. But it goes back to what Arendt meant by atomization. People are not in those relationships. They're watching Fox on the TV. There's no talk. There's not producing knowledge together. These aren't democratic relationships. So it seems to me some of our difficulty in figuring out how to cut into this is there's actually not a relational way to do it in communities where we don't live. Whereas, you know, I'm a teacher, I do it in a classroom, and over 12 weeks, you can do something. But otherwise, it seems sort of like, instead of a staircase, it's just one big step, and it's not clear how to do it at all. I don't know if, Emma, if in your work you end up actually produce kinds of associational ties in which people start to work out this stuff. I know that's what anti-racist or anti-homophobic practices require.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the tie to my work that would probably be the most relevant is like I'm a multiple rape survivor and I support survivors of rape, but I also work with perpetrators. And so how do I get a perpetrator to talk to me? How do I support them in healing their own harm when they know this about me? You know, it's a completely different affect. It's not an activist, you know, angry affect. It's like
Right.
you are a human and you deserve to be a human, and I do not want to destroy you. I want the world to be better, and I would like to figure out a way for you to not harm people. And so I wonder if, you know, someone who is you know, very, very deep in QAnon or any of these other, you know, more racist focused ideologies that are political, like how can we do that? How can we say, you know, like you're voting against something that would cause me to have fewer rights? And you're also a human. How do we work this out? And there are people, I mean, international peacekeeping does this a lot, you know, they're not always successful, but there are case studies of people doing good work and trying to get these entrenched conflicts dealt with. And we're just,
So this is why you're interested in conflict resolution practices, which ends up being about confronting people's fictions, their narratives that they live by, and trying to produce some other mutual understanding to replace it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the thing about conflict resolution that's complicated is that no one's right. You know, it's about identifying needs and figuring things out. And I think that the left, I mean, everyone just thinks that they're right. And like, I think I'm really
So
right.
true. The self-righteousness is
you know, I'm on a horse so high, you know, exactly. And maybe all of us are. And that's fine, but you have to figure out how to also not just go into a conversation with someone else who's very different and be like, well, you're an idiot. Or
Sabrina,
you're
what do you think about that?
I have a lot of thoughts. One.
Well, start with one.
Yeah. I'll truncate it. They're related. Frank and I were talking about the Hofstadter reading that you assigned us. I don't know, it's either sophomore or senior year. And I just revisited it this past week, and there was something about how like the individual, like a self-individualistic person is more prone and more vulnerable to conspiracy theories rather than someone that is not rooted in self-individualism, and how like that can swing from like the boomer generation, right? So like they were all about in the 60s, like free love, and it sounded very leftist. And then a lot of those leftists became like massive MAGA people. And it's like, how did that happen? And it's because like the thing that roots both like far left and far right people is conspiracy almost. I think that's kind of like a large scale claim to make, but I think it's true. And if you find me in 40, 50 years, a massive far right person, I don't think that's going to happen. But if that happens, just know it's because I'm prone to and vulnerable to conspiracy theory. Based on like the way I was raised, I'm a Black woman, like all of these things like contribute to me being vulnerable to conspiracy. And I think to also bring it back to what you were saying, Emma, about like speaking to the perpetrators, I have an incredibly racist white family side, right? They're horrible, they're awful. I've tried to do a lot of conflict resolution over the past 5 years. Now I'm like 86th from the family, can't talk to anyone because I stir up too much controversy just by like my presence, right? So it's also figuring out like how I can like creating this massive empathy tube. I don't know what to call it, to be able to say like, I love you. I am not here to change your mind. All I'm looking for is for you to love me. And like, when that can't happen, that's when that's when it's gone. When the empathy breaks, then like any sort of conflict resolution or narrative change breaks. And so just, and maybe
So-
that, I mean, maybe that's why I'm
Well,
so pessimistic.
So when, I mean, what we're living through is a situation in which there is a break and there isn't the extension of empathy or membership. That's what transphobic or homophobic or racist politics are about, is the circle of the we gets really small. But the question is then how to engage those folks and whether that's possible.
I think like knowing that I could, because I am potentially vulnerable to conspiracy, to know that we are both vulnerable to conspiracy in different ways, right? Might be like a nice starting point.
And another starting point, just to jump in really quick, is who should have those conversations really, really matters. So it's like how we say, you know, like, don't ask your Black friend about like some 101 anti-racist stuff. Like, do your reading. Don't, you know, overburden certain people because, you know, like, I want people to know a little bit more about pronouns before they talk to me. And so I think that also we can round robin this a little bit, and some people might be better suited to have dispassionate conversations about issues, and maybe some of us can't do it, and that's also fine. Or like maybe you can't do it with your family, and that's also fine, but maybe they would hear it better if someone else talked to them about it.
Right, it may not be Sabrina herself who can do it. I mean, it's surely the case that, at least from my experience of teaching the last, whatever, 6-7 years, that the polarization in the society runs through every family. So it's something that this question of whether we're capable of sharing a world is really being lived out in very intimate ways within kinship systems, and not just sort of red states and blue states. I mean, that's very misleading description of what's going on. There's two things in the chat to mention that Danielle pointed us to. One is the person that Sabrina mentioned. His name is Richard Hofstadter, and he wrote an essay in 1964 called The Paranoid Style in American Politics, which was initially about the John Birch Society and Orange County kind of lunatic anti-communists in the 50s and 60s. And this essay was recovered over the last 5 years to talk about Trump voters. But as Sabrina says, the left historically has also had a very, we would say, dark or conspiratorial sense about the organized powers in the world. And so it's a kind of narration that that really can cut across the political spectrum. And then you would want to go, well, what would be your evidence? What you would start asking, and we haven't talked about evidence much yet, but there is a way to try to talk about evidence in ways that it turns out are very difficult and complicated to do, because evidence is not, again, self-evidently meaningful, and people can mobilize factoids in one way or another, and they don't suffice to settle an argument. They often end up serving sort of as weapons. But that's Hofstadter. Hofstadter imagined that he inhabited reality and that these crazies did not. And so he wrote in this kind of mid-1960s smug certainty that he knew what was really going on. And many of us would find his complacency or his self-certainty about that to be itself rather troubling. but he's sort of an establishment liberal, I guess you would say, in those days. And for anyone who was on the left, he was part of the problem. That's how the layers of this thing start to get complicated. A second thing that was in the chat that let me read for maybe you guys to comment on. Is there a distinction between a belief in a narrative, e.g. climate change is not real, and the actions that people take or don't take as a result of that narrative? Is a wrong belief, that is an incorrect belief, in and of itself a bad thing if it doesn't translate into action? Is the real issue that is what people are doing rather than what they're thinking, if I can put it that way. Do you guys have thoughts about that? I mean, I would say there's no action without prior narrative authorization, and that you just can't separate beliefs and actions so readily. But I don't know if you guys would agree with that or not.
I think I feel the same way. I mean, the actions you take are based on the things that you believe, and the things that you believe shape the way that you interact with the world, whether you consciously decide to act on them or not. You know, you don't have to make the affirmative choice to, I don't know, buy an SUV because you don't believe in climate change. But if you don't believe in climate change, it'll shape the way that you approach others. It'll shape the way that you approach the rest of the world. And you will inevitably act upon that belief in some way.
Right.
Yeah, I think that there's like, I mean, in neurobiology, we say neurons that that wire together, fire together. So the more you think about something, I mean, it creates literal pathways in your brain. So there's also, you know, some sort of like neurobiological reasoning for what both Frank and George are saying. So, and especially because, you know, ideas build on each other. So you might not know that you're doing something because you think climate change is not real, but that could be a factor in who you vote for, how you act, anything.
Right. I wonder, it is the real, do you think that the weather that we've had the last year will be readily mobilized as evidence to persuade people to think otherwise about climate change? My sense is even on the right, they are now starting to credit climate change, which is not to say that they're going to want to be willing to do anything to stop it, but something seems to have changed, and it may be that people, the capacity to let in reality in the form of weather events may be making some difference. There really is something going on here about whether people's prior dispositions can be displaced by their experience, that compels them to be reflective in a new way. I don't know if that's happening or not. Danielle, I imagine you're going to say it's time to.
I know I always have the unfun job. I don't want to cut it too short. I know we had some other questions in the chat, and we probably won't get to answering all of them. But yeah, I'm here.
Yes, I see. The Tiger has a question that is, if meaning making and narrative is based on experience, could the major divergence in narrative that we see today be the result of a wide-scale lack of shared experience?
Yeah, I think so. I think the biggest problem in terms of making some sort of coherent narrative of what our life is, and in this country and in the world in general, is our inability to do that is because we don't have collective institutions that would allow us to do that, right? I mean, I don't think we, like, this country has always had super robust collective institutions, but certainly now I'd say they're at their weakest point maybe ever. And that atomization leads people to construct their own meaning and to find out what they think this whole thing is about. But that project is best accomplished together, where you can work alongside someone incredibly different from you, and through a common struggle, through working toward a common goal, you see yourself reflected through them, and you see them reflected in yourself. Yes. You form this common idea of humanity and what it means to be alive and to be a political actor.
Yeah, I mean, there's the old democratic version of that was something like the township model of local self-government, in which people would get in town halls together and figure out whether to build a road or what have you. And then there's the social movement version, where people make the union movement or the women's movement or so on, civil rights movement, actually enormous differences in the Black community, but people negotiated them, and likewise in turn across racial divides. So the second, there's this sense that of social movements providing a learning experience. One could say that this happened 2 summers ago during the George Floyd protests, and public opinion changed dramatically about the role of race. White opinion changed by 50 points in terms of crediting that there really was endemic racism in a way that has never happened. And that was because of people's witnessing and participating in protests. So there are these occasions in which people actually can learn together. But they're also like, it is sporadic or episodic or eviscerated. I mean, depending on which kind of venue we're talking about.
I'm somewhat confused about that. On the white side of my family, they went through like a whole racial awakening last summer, where they like understood that it was bad that a police officer laid on the neck of George Floyd. However, they are not getting vaccinated. They voted for Trump again in 2020. They are even more mad at the left. And it's almost like, well, what was all of that for? Is like, was that empathy even worth it? I mean, we had extensive conversations about this last summer. And I walked away from every single one of them and I was like, okay, I think we're making incremental steps. But if those incremental steps are not actually, I'm going to go back to this question because I think it's fascinating. VK's question about the wrong belief and does it translate into action? They had the right belief, but then they took the wrong action. And it's like, how many people are doing this thing, right? And so it's like, I've said, I think this is my 3rd time across this past hour, how I've said how pessimistic I am about everything. I think to say to Tiger, I'm not here to make my experience shared. I don't want to share my experience. I think it's futile. I think it's a lot of energy on my time. And then I also think it's a lot of energy for me to expect other white individuals to be able to say, I share this experience with you. And I see this across class. I see this across gender. I see this across sexuality. I think it's like, I'm tired. I'm done. I'm going to make sure my neighbor is fed. And that's it. And this is something that I think Frank and we had this like horrifyingly long 3-hour conversation in New Orleans with our other friends last weekend. And I think I said the same thing. I think I'm just like, people believe what they believe, and nobody should not have their living needs met. Nobody should be out of healthcare. Nobody should be undereducated. Nobody should have mental illness that isn't treated. You know what I mean? Like all of these things, people deserve it all. And that's what I'm going to be here to do, because any sort of like emotional, empathetic level that I can get to, it's too much. It's too much. Somebody
It's
take it
really
away.
the opposite of Emma's entire practice of life, which is so much about making, I mean, if I hear this right, Emma, you're living in a very different way in terms of engaging a perpetrator, you know, across that really violent difference.
Yeah, I mean, diversity in action. We all do what we can, you know. Some
Right.
people are lawyers, some people are doctors, some people are whatever. And so I talk to the perpetrators, but I'm not saying anyone else needs to.
Right.
Absolutely.
Right. You're not going to require Sabrina to talk to her family anymore.
Definitely don't think you should talk to your family. That sounds toxic. So sorry.
It does sound pretty bad.
But I think we're also over time, so I'll stop.
Yes.
I know, maybe it's just keep talking to the Gallatin family is probably the best way to go right now.
Right. An adopted kinship model.
Yes, the chosen Gallatin family,
Yes.
as I like to think of it.
Yes.
You know, I said it earlier at our previous event with Professor Louise Hartman, because the same thing happened. And, you know, last year we had booked our events much closer in time together. And so this year we had more buffer in between, and it's still never enough time, because I think when you bring Galatinos in a room physically or virtually together, this is what happens. And it's wonderful. It's very dynamic and stimulating. So I want to say thank you to each of you, to Emma and Frank and Sabrina, for giving so generously of yourselves and your perspectives and your lived experiences.
Thank you,
Very
guys. It was really great. Yeah.
And thank you, George, for facilitating. I think we all of us on the call agree that you always make this happen and you get our brain juices flowing. So thank you to each of you. And thank you to everyone on the call for joining us this afternoon. There are lots of other events happening during Alumni Weekend, and you can explore them on the platform and the website and continue participating in things. But this is our last Gallatin event of the weekend. And I just want to say thank you again for ending us on this note. And you've given us all a lot more to think about and for our brains to chew on. So I take my hat off to all of you and thank you once again.
It's great to see many of you out in the audience. Shout outs. I see Jonathan and Tiger. I see Maureen. How nice to see you.
And I think
Jakia.
Suzanne also has her hand up too. Suzanne, I don't
okay.
know. Jen, can we get Suzanne on? I think that's a raised hand, I think.
Maybe it's
Actually,
a clapping hand.
I was trying to clap,
Oh,
but I put my hand up instead.
well, it's okay. It could be
Sorry.
like a high five.
Yeah,
There you go.
exactly. No, really, really interesting conversation. Thank you all very much. Of course, I have 100 things to say, but I've restrained myself.
I know we need a part 2. We'll definitely have to do something again. Thank you for all your comments in the chat too. Everyone's been enjoying this, and thank you all so much. We're gonna wrap up our event, and we appreciate you all being here. Have a great rest of your weekends.
Bye, everybody.
On
Hi. Jen, are we still recording?